So with the recent news of the Batman 2 script being finished and the movie soon going into pre-production, I wanted to look at all of the recent updates we've been given for the Batman Part 2 in addition to the groundwork that's been established in the first movie and the Penguin series to really go and pin down the likely culprits for the villain in this sequel. And I am going to be starting with the 30 biggest Batman villains just in terms of overall popularity and using the clues we've been given to kind of narrow that down into the final list or the final villain option I believe will take place in the Batman 2. So starting with some of the obvious no's for the villain options, just going off of the deaths that have already happened in this universe, you of course have Carmine Falcone being shot by the Riddler at the end of the first movie, in addition to Alberto Falcone being killed by the Penguin in the beginning of that show, and you also have Sal Baroni being killed by the Penguin later on in the season as well. But really shifting to interviews with Matt Reeves in terms of his vision for the Batman Part 2 in relation to this whole world that he's really set up. It seems like you have a pretty clear double down on the grounded nature of this franchise. You do have him explaining this as being a Gotham that feels like a place in our world, and that he doesn't really want to lean into the fantastical and everything is really meant to feel quite grounded. So I think that alone pretty much eliminates a good majority of these villains. Even though I think Mr. Freeze is a fan favorite for the Batman Part 2, I just don't think you can really properly adapt him into this universe without fundamentally changing a lot of the prime aspects of his character. And I think Mr. Freeze would be much more of a proper fit for James Gunn's Batman. I would also say the same thing for Poison Ivy. If she was really watered down to just an environmentalist in this movie, I don't think that would really be enough to provide proper interest. For someone like Deathstroke, in terms of being a super soldier, is just a little bit out of the style element. For someone like Clayface, I think it's pretty obvious with the spin-off movie in the DCU that not only is that character too much of a fantastical element to fit in all of this, but I don't think they would really use any of these same characters in this sense. And even though I think the Flood could open up the possibility for someone like Killer Croc, I just don't see how he could really fit into the nature of this universe. For someone like Firefly, I think that is a little bit more closer to reality, but I don't really think you could make him believable unless he is, of course, flying around town. And even with a suit or mechanism that could enable him to do that, I just really don't see Firefly being a fit into the dynamic of Gotham that we've been given already. I think Man-Bat is also a similar no, since he is just more of science fiction and more animalistic. For someone like Mad Hatter, again, even though he doesn't have any crazy powers, I think the whole element of mind control is just a little bit far-fetched. And I also think someone like Solomon Grundy is just too far out of the norm for this universe, and I think he could also be a better fit for the DCU Batman or the DCU Gotham as well. And then looking to the next round of elimination, I think it's also pretty safe to say that they're not going to do anything that's been done already. I don't think the Riddler is going to have anything to do with this, of course. Maybe he could come back into the picture in the third movie, but I don't see that being an option. In terms of the Joker, we obviously know he's in this universe with the deleted scene, but I think in comparison to The Dark Knight being also the sequel to the Batman Begins or the Nolan and Bale grounded Batman trilogy, I just really don't think you're going to do a pretty similar plot to that movie, even if this is a different version of the Joker. And similar to the Riddler, I think there's maybe a way to utilize both of those characters in a third film to really finish off the trilogy. But in terms of the DCEU, I think there was just too much of a usage for Harley Quinn for her to fit into this universe, nor do I think she really fits the style of this as well. In terms of Two-Face, I think that's a little bit tricky because he also played a major role in The Dark Knight, but I think really if you think of The Dark Knight, you still would see the Joker as the main villain, even though Two-Face really becomes the antagonist by the end of the film. However, I just really don't see a path where Two-Face could play a similar role in this movie. I think if you did include the character of Harvey Dent, I think his arc is just too predictable in terms of where that could go in this movie. And I think if anything, a more feasible option would be to just include the character of Harvey Dent, but you don't have his arc in this movie. And for Ra's al Ghul, even though I think he usually is much more of a fantastic character in terms of his immortality, you did see him being watered down with the Liam Neeson portrayal in the Nolan and Bale verse, and he played a really pivotal part to that first movie. So I just really don't see him fitting into any of this. And also, since we know that Batman is well past his origin in this franchise, I don't see him really coming into play. And if anything, I see a more fantastical version of his character being an option for James Gunn's vision of Batman. On a similar note, for someone like Scarecrow, even though he was a part of Batman Begins, I really don't think you have too much of a focus on him in the Nolan and Bale trilogy, so I think that's still an option, even though you have seen a live action portrayal of him here. And for someone like Deadshot, who's a little bit more niche, I think with the similar Harley Quinn portrayal, I just don't see his character being a viable option for a major antagonist in this world, even though I could see him playing a part in terms of being a hired assassin or sniper for any of the ongoing street crime in Gotham. And also with Bane or Tom Hardy's portrayal in The Dark Knight Rises, I think that's just too much of a similar path to include him in here. You do have the adrenaline reference at the end of the first movie, but I think that's not enough of a similarity to the Venom that Bane uses to really include him in any of this. But now shifting to more quotes or more paraphrasing from what Matt Reeves has said more recently in relation to this movie. You do have a pretty brief but interesting quote on what he gave in terms of his response to the villain of this movie, is that he did describe the antagonist as being a continuation in a certain way for this world, but also being different in another aspect, and the villain really creating a divide for Robert Pattinson's character and really showing a different side of him. I think the use of the word, or the use of saying specifically this being a continuation in this sense, pretty much clarifies that the villain has somewhat already been set up in this universe. So for one, for someone like Black Mask, even though I could see him fitting into a lot of the nature and makeup of what's happening in Gotham, or even being a rival to the Penguin, since you really didn't have any talk of him in the first movie or in the Penguin series, especially with the power vacuum after the fallout of Carmine Falcone, I just don't really think you can rush him into the picture unless he was referenced already. I think the same could be mentioned for someone like Hugo Strange. I don't really think you have any indication of including his character in any fashion in this universe. And for the case of someone like Red Hood, I don't think you have enough development for something like that to come into play this early. And you also have the recent rumors of Robin being a part of the Batman Part 2 being debunked. And for someone like Professor Pig, who I think could also fit this dynamic, I just don't think he's enough of a tie-in to anything that's happened yet. And for more niche villains like Phantasm or Calendar Man, I don't think you have any nods to them as well to really go in that direction. But really, I think any talk of a continuation has to be taken with a grain of salt, because we do know that there still is likely going to be a second season of The Penguin that will happen after this second movie. And you also have another reference made by Matt Reeves, who mentioned that The Penguin is a pivotal entry point in terms of the story and the antagonist for the Batman Part 2, but he can't really go into what happens after that. So I think in a lot of ways he's pretty clearly saying that the Penguin will play a part in this movie, but he isn't the central antagonist. I think more of his development is going to be saved for that second season. And with him, I think Sophia Falcone's story is going to continue mostly in the second season of The Penguin, even though it does look like she could play a part in this movie as well. I don't see her as the main antagonist. And for someone like Scarecrow, who was teased with the Easter eggs of his costume in the background, or the character of Dr. Julian Rush, or Sophia's psychologist, looking like he has some sort of ties to Scarecrow, I think that would be a really interesting option that is going to be explored more in the second season of The Penguin. And I also think Dr. Julian Rush just immediately jumping to the main villain in Gotham is a little bit too forced in terms of any of the setup that's been given so far. So I think that really leaves us with just two options, either Hush or Thomas Elliot and the Court of Owls. I think you have set up for both of them here, but I really think James Gunn's recent social media comments pretty much give this away. And you do have him replying to a comment or a rumor on Hush being the main villain of the Batman Part 2, and he pretty much replied to that directly and said that anything you've heard about the Batman Part 2 villain is either made up or just a guess entirely. So I think the fact that he was replying to Hush specifically pretty much rules that out. So I really think when it comes down to it, that the Court of Owls is the obvious direction for the antagonist here. And I think it is also a perfect fit to the dynamic that's been established for this Gotham. I think there's just too many references to the Court of Owls that are really hard to be ignored. So I definitely think it fits that continuation, but it's still different in a lot of aspects, because I think the Court of Owls as an organization is a big difference than the Riddler in the first movie. And in terms of Oz being an entry point to this, I think it's pretty clear his rise to power throughout the Penguin series, along with his meeting with the city council member at the end of the show, is Oz's entry into a higher power. And I think also with that scene, you see the new mayor creating a task force, which I think would be the other half of a more honest power in Gotham that either isn't aware of the Court of Owls or that is really trying to combat a lot of that corruption from within. So that could be an interesting political rivalry. And I think in terms of the antagonist really challenging Robert's character as described by Reeves, I think this could mean on one hand that maybe Bruce Wayne joins the Court of Owls and uses his status in Gotham to really spy on the organization and really to become a double agent. And I also think for the character of Batman, it could really have him question the history of Gotham and his morals and ethics overall, or even just his overall identity as a crime fighter if he's combating street crime to make Gotham a better place, but he learns even more about the dual nature of Gotham with the Court of Owls. I think he could really be confused what his role is with Batman. So that's really my best bet for the Batman Part 2, but feel free to let me know your thoughts on any of this, and I'll see you later.